Pablo is going to be a great guest. He's been working on this issue for quite a while. And I think that what interests us the most is just as background. We've been working on Latin American issues for over 10 years. And we've been writing quite a lot about the kind of new independence of South America, especially, but Latin America in general. It's something that's not very welcome here in Washington. In fact, we're the only ones who really talk about it as though it's a really good thing that this whole continent is now more independent of the United States than Europe is. And so this is kind of, I think, one really important aspect of it is that countries like Bolivia, which is only 9 million people and it's the poorest country in South America, can actually have their own foreign policy, which is something that never really happened before, and they can make a difference on an issue that is particular concern to them. And it's not just for particular concern either. It's not just that they're already losing water supply, but it's also there's this kind of sense of solidarity among the countries, especially in South America, that you see over and over again in recent years. And I think Pablo will probably talk about it, but it's the idea that first of all, you don't just pursue your own national interest in the narrowest terms. If you talk to people in the Bolivian government and the Ecuadorian government, in the Venezuelan government, you hear them say things that you don't normally hear from people representing their government. They're looking at it from the world, the perspective of the world. And of course, Bolivia has its own perspective because of its indigenous culture that has a lot to say about climate change and what we have to do about it. And so I think that's a really interesting part of it. I mean, they went out, and the other part, of course, that is I think, specific to Bolivia and to these left-of-center countries is, they didn't like what happened in Copenhagen, so they went out and tried to organize people and social movements, and they had the conference in Cochabamba. And again, Pablo will talk about the details of it, but this was something that really moved the whole negotiation process. And it was because they went outside the process. They said, well, we don't want decisions being made behind closed doors, and we're going to involve the people in this and generate some pressure worldwide. The old idea, if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. And so that, I think, is another interesting aspect of it. Now, the other part of it, of course, is that pressure has to come from somewhere because the rich countries are obviously not doing their share. And and this is where we have done a little research at CEPR, for example. We did a paper showing that if the United States, for example, the United States adopted the reduced hours of Europe. So in other words, Europe has been taking its productivity gains in the form of shorter hours, whereas we have continued to work the same amount of time and consumed more. But if we moved in that direction, that by itself would have a huge impact on the overall global temperature. And so that was just one thing that we did, and we were really happy to see that. In fact, Germany responded to this recession in that way by reducing work hours and maintaining. Their unemployment is actually less than it was before the recession started, even though they had a much bigger drop in GDP in 2009 than we did. So you have these steps that the rich countries could take. It's easier for them. Pablo will talk a lot more about climate justice and the idea that, of course, it's their responsibility. It's our responsibility in the rich countries because we're the ones who put most of the carbon in the atmosphere. And per capita, of course, we have a much higher emissions. You want to start with Juliet's question about the...
Sure. I was asking, obviously, we're at this significant moment where people are questioning whether the UN climate process can deliver any concrete outcomes. And what I'm trying to get a sense of is how Bolivia sees the process, which clearly is a process that gives developing countries a voice, but has been unable to, for example, translate into a binding agreement. So if you could just talk a little about how Bolivia sees this process at this moment, what you are trying to achieve, and to what extent you think it can actually produce something that will make a difference on climate.
Yeah, well, we haven't arrived to an agreement, not because the multilateral process is bad or wrong. It's because some of the countries haven't followed the multilateral process. The failure of Copenhagen is not because 192 countries weren't able to come to an agreement. The failure of Copenhagen is because a group of countries tried to kidnap the democratic process of the 192 member states and tried to come with an agreement the last day at 3 a.m. in the morning and ask the rest to accept it. So I see in the media a campaign saying that we are here in the middle of a situation that is going bad because it's very difficult to have 192 countries come together, and that's not the truth. I'm an ambassador in the UN, and we negotiate, and we have managed to accomplish many agreements on the issues, on different issues that are very, very tough. But the problem here is the attempt to not follow that rule. So that if in Cancun we see that again, of course, a failure, and a very big failure, is possible.
Mr. Ambassador, excuse me, Ambassador de Alba was in town about a month ago and spoke to many of us here. And among the things he said was that Mexico has been trying very hard in preparing for Cancun to structure a process that could be described as from the bottom up rather than the top down, in an effort to avoid the kinds of outcomes that hurt Copenhagen. Do you agree that Mexico is doing that, or perhaps more politely, how would you rate Mexico's efforts in that regard?
I would say that Mexico is trying to do its best to try to hear the positions of all. The Foreign Affairs Minister of Mexico, for example, has went to Bolivia, and we have been invited to several meetings in Mexico. But all of these meetings are to dialogue, not to negotiate. We don't agree on nothing. The agreement is to discuss between us, but to let the agreements be developed in the formal, in the official process of negotiation. So that is the rule. I think Mexico has organized until now 4 or 5 meetings of this sort. So we are not against having a meeting with 40 countries to discuss. But when 40 countries come together and say, we're not only going to discuss and exchange point of views and try to reach some common positions, but we are going to begin to draft the agreement or the accord without the rest, then becomes the problem. The agreement with Mexico has been that all of these meetings that have taken place have been only meetings to exchange these views, to try to find common points. But the process of negotiation is in the formal process of the UNFCCC. And until now, that rule has been maintained. And it is key that in this last process until Cancun and until the last day, this will keep. And if it's so, then I would say we can have a good outcome, a regular outcome, a bad outcome, but it will be the outcome of all 192, not of a group of small countries. Because if we can achieve success, let us, all 182, achieve success or failure. We can also have failures, but let us do it, and not like it happened in Copenhagen.
So if that media narrative that there's too many countries to actually foster some sort of agreement is not correct, what do you think the reason is for that kidnapping of the Copenhagen process?
I mean, the problem is not that there are too many countries that cannot come to an agreement. That's, if you go to a negotiation, we negotiate in groups. So what does that mean? Bolivia is part of a group. That's the G77 plus China. So that is 130 countries. The European Union negotiates as a group. Then you have CANS, and you have inside the G77 the African group, EOSIS. So it's not something that, you know, what I think the perception that the media is giving to the public is that there are 192 people asking for the floor at the same time, and that's not true. You have representatives from the different regional groups that come with positions. In some of the issues, we act under our national capacities. So let's say there are 10 issues in finance, and we have common positions in 8. Okay, we act as G77 in 8 of these issues, and in these other 2, we act under national capacity. That means sometimes there is position from this, from that. So in reality, you have a process that is very common, very organized in a way. So you have to respect that. And when a small group of countries wants to do something else, it's because they want to have an outcome that benefits them and not benefits all. So the problem with the Copenhagen Accord has to do with a substantive issue. Those countries that wanted to kidnap the process was because they wanted to achieve one thing that was impossible to achieve in a negotiation of the 192. What was that? They wanted to kill the Kyoto Protocol. And of course, if you try to kill the Kyoto Protocol in the 192 in a negotiation where everybody participates, that is never going to happen. So this is you do this not because it's very difficult to come to an agreement between 192. It is, what do you want to achieve that you cannot achieve if you have everybody in an open discussion?
Can you talk both specifically about what you see as Bolivia's role and goals for this upcoming set of talks, and also how you would characterize what you think the U.S. has been doing on the world stage on climate, and how you see their role? Could you speak to both of those?
Well, from our point of view, the key issue of climate change and in Cancun is we need to come out of Cancun with a target of emission reductions for developed countries that stabilize the increase of the temperature in this century in something between 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I mean, that would be the great success, because all of this negotiation is about that. There are other issues, but you can come out with finance or with transfer of technology with good outcomes. But if you don't cut in a very substantive way the emissions from developed countries, then we are going to all suffer the consequences that we are already suffering. So for us, this is the key issue. And that is why we are pushing very hard that in Cancun we will have an outcome on this issue. Second, it is necessary to have finance, it's necessary to have transfer of technology in a very also significant way. Because actually what we are seeing is that in the Copenhagen Accord they have said $30,000 of $30 billion for the next 3 years. But how much has been delivered during the first year? You can go into a webpage that's called
Climate finance, I believe, no?
Fast
Fast Start.
Yeah,
Fast
Fast
Start.
Start, that's right.
and check really. And the problem is how much of that money is really new, fresh. It's not ODA that was already agreed. So even with this small fast start of $30 billion, there is a problem. With the other figure of the $100 billion, there is also the same problem because in the agreement, you know, the devil is on the words. You say $100 billion, that's a good figure. But it says mobilize $100 billion. So there is a difference between saying provide $100 billion and other things to say mobilize $100 billion, because if it says provide, then you have to provide. If it says mobilize, that means you have to mobilize. And how are you going to mobilize? You're going to mobilize it, well, you can mobilize it also from developing countries, from private sector, through markets, but really how much are you going to put from your pocket? And that is the permanent question that wherever I go, I ask our friends from developed countries is, how much are you going to put from your pockets into this climate change issue? Because we can also say mobilize $500 billion.
And the comment on the U.S.?
Well, in relation to the U.S., I think the U.S. is key. Is key because the whole problem is that the U.S. is saying that they are going to do an emission reduction of 17%, taking into account the levels of 2005. That means a reduction of only 3%, taking into account the levels of 1990 by 2020. But in the Kyoto Protocol, for the first commitment period that is going to end in 2012, the global goal was 5.2%. So the US is saying that by 2020 is not even going to do what was the target of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And this has a very big consequence, because many other developed countries say, if the US is not going to do a very big effort, why should we do it? We are going to lose our competitiveness with the US. So we also are going to be very, we're going to wait and see. And others begin to say the same. If the US is not going to be part of the Kyoto Protocol, well, why don't we all get out of the Kyoto Protocol? And some other countries are saying that. And suddenly you see the whole scenario moving not up as we needed with a bigger commitment in emission reductions, but down. This is the key issue. If the US doesn't make any positive move before Cancun and during Cancun, we will have a failure in Cancun, especially in relation to the key issue of the negotiation,
And
that
do you-
is the emissions reduction.
And do you think that's likely given the election environment here?
I think that is why it's sadness, because what is happening here is that the whole process of multilateral negotiation is being in some way kidnapped by an election in one country. So, and I have heard it many times in official meetings in the negotiating process of the UNFCCC, where countries say, what are we doing here? 192 nations sitting here waiting to see what is going to happen in the election of one country, and we are all depending on that. That's not multilateralism.
So isn't it unrealistic then to hope that you can get real targets set in Cancun? I mean, should you maybe revise your goals and revise your plan? A lot of people.
That is why we organize in Bolivia the People's World Conference on Climate Change, because we think that the only way things can move is if there is a social pressure, that's a pressure from civil society, and especially here in the US. If that's not the case, then of course, what we'll see that politics is going to define the future, and politics in one state is going to define the future of humankind. And that's something that we cannot accept.
And the worst kind of politics, too.
Yeah, well, I don't want to judge because it's the US, but
I can.
But what can you do? I mean, if that's the case, you can't really do much, right?
Well, I believe in humankind. I don't think humankind is going to just wait and see how everything keeps going down the hill. And I think that we can't do it. We have to do something. And that is what is the main position of Bolivia. The position of Bolivia is to appeal and to work with all civil society groups to change this. Because that is the only way. If there is a pressure coming from the bottom to these governments that are putting in front elections, how many seats are they going to have in the Senate, in front of the critical issue. What is going to happen if 1/3 of our glaciers that have already melted, now another third melts in the next 10 years? And that is not hypothetical. That is going to happen.
And in a completely unrelated issue, but you see the same trend with the capital flow dispute, developed countries having a position against the emerging markets. Do you see that as a reflection of what could happen on this issue also? This, a confrontation between mature economies, like the IMF call it, and emerging markets. That economic, there is a stagnation on that issue also, and it seems very similar to what's going on this issue also. Do you see
I think that they're two different issues.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to trade, you can bargain. When it comes to life, you can't bargain. And when we speak about climate change, we're speaking about life. So it's a very bad thing to try to apply the same process of negotiation of the WTO to the UNFCCC. I can understand that in the WTO you are going to say, oh, I'm not going to lower my tariffs if you don't do this and my subsidies. Because, of course, you're negotiating your economical interests as a country. But in this case, nobody's going to win. It's not the US who's going to win at the end. We're all going to go to a worldwide catastrophe. And the US too. I think that many politicians don't understand that and apply WTO rules to a UNFCCC negotiation.
And do you see, so obviously Bolivia is very invested in the idea of making the multilateral process of the UN FCCC work. Is there either any, if that doesn't produce, if it produces a bad outcome or a failure like you're saying, is there any alternative that Bolivia sees to get meaningful action on climate change? Or is it simply a matter of doing everything to push for the UN climate talks?
Well, from our point of view, in an issue like climate change, you cannot come with an agreement of only some group of countries and try to impose it to the rest. That's not possible. that has already failed. I'm surprised that some delegations are thinking to repeat the same failure of Copenhagen with different words. And I repeat what I said at the beginning. The multilateral process of negotiation didn't fail in Copenhagen. What failed in Copenhagen was the opposite. Now we have to see, we have to keep to the rules, but as we have been discussing, if there is not a good agreement, it's not going to be because of this process of negotiation of 192 countries. It's because the US is going to put in front its elections there rather than climate change. That's the truth. It doesn't have to do with a negotiation of 192 countries. So you cannot try to, how do you say, to hide the real cause by saying, oh, the problem is because too many countries are negotiating here. We should have a smaller process. No, no, no. The real problem is what you are not willing to do because of your national and political and economical situation.
Sir, I haven't heard one leader believing in an agreement in Cancun. They are pointing towards South Africa for the better. That'd be Germany, India, Norway, and other countries. Well, why go to Cancun at all? Why not just continue working in these groups?
Of course, you will need to develop the details, but you have to have the framework of the agreement in Cancun. Because, for example, are we going to agree in the establishment of a new climate change fund? This should be agreed in Cancun. Now, the details of how this is going to be developed, organized, the structure, many of these issues will have to be developed from here until South Africa. But we need to have that. We need to be clear on what is going to happen in relation to emission reduction. What is going to be the target? That doesn't mean that because you have that, then everything is already solved. Then there is a discussion on how this is going to be implemented through the amendment of the Kyoto Protocol, the different possibilities that you have there in the amendment of that establishes Article 3.9, and so on. But if you go out of Cancun without saying, oh, well, just keep negotiating, well, I mean, but what for it specifically? Under what framework? We need to decide that in Cancun.
And in terms of the substance, for example, the Prime Minister of Norway has said not all of the 100 billion will come from governments, or many countries who say, we understand that there's a significant group of countries who want a between 1 and 1.5 degree temperature threshold, but there are many countries that want a 2 degree threshold. Are those substantive issues non-negotiable for Bolivia and many other countries? Are you willing to accept a weaker agreement if there can be a broader consensus, or do you see, for example, those two goals as critical to any final deal?
Well, in relation to that issue, the problem here is that it's not the negotiation between the 2 degrees Celsius and the 1.5 or the 1. The real problem is that the actual pledges from developed countries are between 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, an increase of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. So if we would agree on the Copenhagen Accord, on the pledges that are now on the table, we will see an increase in the temperature from 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. Not even the 2 degrees Celsius that the Copenhagen Accord speaks about. So that is why it is so critical. I mean, we are very worried about Cancun. You ask me, I'm very optimistic. I'm very worried. Not because I want to see an agreement, because I want to see an agreement and every happy ending story. No, the problem is what is going to happen an increase in the temperature to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius means how many island states are going to disappear, what's going to happen with our glaciers, what is going to happen with food security, with desertification in Africa, and more floods in Asia, and so on. And you can review all the different scientific reports. The current pledges are saying, or are in the range of an increase to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. That is not acceptable. So if you ask me, would you accept that? No. What is my red line? My red line is that no country should disappear because of climate change. I'm not willing, Bolivia will not sign any agreement that means that there will be a member state that will be underwater.
A lot of the, do you want to?
No, I was going to ask, because the Mexican ambassador last month called a progress the inclusion of the Cancun agenda including in the conversation the indigenous group that hadn't been. He called that as a progress. Do you agree with that? Is that also, how important is that?
We think that Mexico has done, tried to promote talks with different sectors, not only with the government, has promoted with the private sector, also with indigenous people. And the important thing about the meeting that took place in Mexico with indigenous people has to do with one issue that I want to speak about, because we are also very afraid about this in Cancun. That has to do with the commodification of nature, the commodification of forests. Because what indigenous people told to Mexico and to the different delegations from governments that went there was, we see red, reduction emission from deforestation and degradation of forests, as an option, but don't use that option to privatize nature and to commodify forests. To develop, do not use it to develop a new market mechanism that will be linked to the forests. This is a key issue. And we have said it in Tianjin just a couple of weeks ago. As Bolivia, we fully support the idea to have a fund related to forests in order to support activities that protect forests, not only in relation to mitigation, but to adaptation, to water, to biodiversity, but not through market mechanisms. We are very worried because at this present moment, we are having in Nagoya the summit of Biodiversity Convention. And we are seeing there a proposal that is very similar to the proposal for forests, but there it's more broad. It is for all biodiversity, for all environmental services, and with the same direction, that is, commodify nature. What is the reason or the argument behind this? Is, from their point of view, is what has happened is that nobody takes care of nature. Atmosphere is part of nature, forest. Why? Because it doesn't have a value, a monetary value. So we have to give it a monetary value. Once it has a monetary value, then somebody has to have rights over that nature, call it forests, biodiversity, and then we will begin to protect. So apply the rules of market to reestablish this unbalance that we have provoked with nature. And that is one main conception that is moving on in climate change, in biodiversity. From our point of view, it's exactly the opposite. We say we are here because we have developed a model, a system that has put in first place profit, because when you speak about markets, you speak about profit. You want to commodify something, it's because you're going to win some kind of profit, because you exchange that product with another product. And if we're going to apply those rules now to prevent this impact to climate change and to nature, we are going to precisely apply to give as a remedy the epidemic cause that provoked all this conflict. This is key. We have said, watch out. We have said in Tianjin, we are not going to accept that you open a discussion, or not a discussion we fully agree with opening, that you approve without having a very intensive discussion about this issue, that everybody gets to know what you're going to agree. Because nobody knows what is in the negotiation in relation to this issue, and the consequences are going to be very, very big. So we have clearly said no implementation of market mechanism in forests in climate change, and we're also saying the same in Nagoya. Let's open a discussion. Let's discuss frankly, seeing what are the benefits, what are the negative impact of applying those kind of mechanisms, but you cannot launch that suddenly in Cancun without nobody knowing exactly what is going to happen.
So I want to make sure I understand this crystal clear. It's from the U.S. perspective, the notion of preserving forests, and by taking certain forest management activities that are approved that support the ability of indigenous peoples to remain living in the forests and doing what they do, and use these activities to demonstrate a reduction in CO2, and use that to count towards a utility or another emitter's obligation to cut. That's how I've always understood it. Mm-hmm. What is wrong with that? How does that hurt the forest?
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
confused.
Okay.
I mean, I understand nobody wants
Yeah.
to slice up nature and then sell it to the highest bidder.
Yeah.
But as I have understood this argument, this has been a way to preserve the forest and to extend
Okay.
these benefits.
Okay. Well, let's see. For example, in the case of a forest, what are the problems of this market mechanism? You are a company here that has to reduce 1 ton of CO2,
Right.
and you have to spend $50. And you have a forest, and because that forest sells a certificate of emission reduction that says for 1 ton you have to pay $15.
Yeah.
So you, instead of doing your emission reduction here, you just buy a certificate that's for $15.
Okay.
What you should do here. So first problem,
Yeah.
who's reducing?
The forest is.
We,
Yeah.
the developing
Yeah.
country, not you.
Okay.
And you are responsible of doing this.
I understand.
Second, who's financing who? We are financing you. Because instead of you spending $50 here to do your job, we are saying you're done, you're okay, and you only have to spend $15. So in reality, it's not a mechanism to finance indigenous people. But then the situation gets even worse, because you have bought your certificate at $15, but then somebody else that is going to have to spend $70 to reduce 1 ton tells you, why don't you sell me that certificate? And you say, oh, that's a good idea. I bought it in $15, I can sell it in $55 now. And the other one will say, okay, for me it's okay. And then he can sell it to another one. And then you have a market. And probably that certificate will end up costing $120, $150. But it's the same CO2 ton. It wasn't more. So you created what? A bubble.
Carbon bubble.
Yeah. You will have a carbon bubble like the one you had just a couple of years ago here with real estate.
Yeah.
And what is going to happen? But then there is the fourth problem. Once you own that certificate, what do you own? Do you own the forest? No. But you own the capacity of the forest to stock the CO2. So you have a right over one function of the forest. You have one property right. We are beginning to see a new kind of property, because until now you have the property of, I own this iPad, I own my house, my car. That's a property of goods. Then you have the property, intellectual property. This is going to be another kind of property, because you're not going to own the forest itself. You're going to begin to have property rights over one of the functions. But then comes the problem. How the state is going to guarantee your property right? And what happens if your property right over that function of the forest comes in conflict with the property rights of indigenous people, local communities, or the state? This is something that we clearly say cannot be launched in Cancun.
Now, and can I just follow up, and I'm afraid I'll leave as this, but one, so the whole idea of cap and trade, is politically dead in the United States. So one, I imagine you must be happy that basically the idea of creating this market is no longer a political option in the U.S. Would that be, or would you be glad that that's not, it's not politically viable, it will not be created here in the United States and then your term? So I guess I was wondering if you would...
I don't know why you say it's dead.
Because even the most ardent supporters of it say they can no longer, they have no chance of getting it enacted.
You should see the negotiators of the U.S. in the climate change negotiations, and they are not saying at all that they are promoting a dead proposal.
Well, maybe they're promoting it at the international level, I think, and it's possible that they
Maybe
recognize
right, maybe in
Julie's
exactly.
talking about within the U.S.
Yeah,
within
but the
US.
real driver of the money in the United States right now, there's not a strong possibility. But it's okay if that's not, if that's not manifesting itself yet in the UN process, then that's fine. But I was just wondering, since I know you came back you were in Tianjin, is there anything that you would just tell us about what you feel like the mood was there, or what you take away from that session in terms of its implications for the prospects of meaningful action on climate change?
Well, we all went out of Tianjin saying we have made some progress in relation to finance, transfer of technology, adaptation, especially when it comes to the institutional arrangements. But we also went out very worried because of the targets in emission reductions from developed countries. And we also went very worried out of Tianjin because of the discussion on the establishment of this new marketing mechanism in relation to carbon, to forest and nature.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have an informal meeting that's going to be, we call it the pre-COP. In reality, it's not an official pre-COP because nothing will be negotiated there. But it's going to be at the ministerial level
Mhm.
in Mexico, the 4th and 5th of November. We are moving in order to see how we can advance in all the texts, and I think we can advance in almost all the texts. But in order to have an outcome, there has to be a movement in relation to emission reduction, and that means a movement from the US. That is the problem.
Sir, Ambassador, emerging economies, developing countries are now lifting millions of people out of poverty. The downside maybe being that emissions do rise. What responsibility do emerging markets, developing countries have in this regard?
As the convention says, we all have common responsibilities, but they are not the same. We say common but differential responsibility, taking into account the historical accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, China, for example, has presented a plan, and all developed countries, I haven't heard until now, nobody saying, oh, that plan is to deviate from its business as usual is bad, or it's not enough. In the negotiations, what I have heard is it's okay. China is saying a deviation from 45% from their business as usual. So it's not that everybody's saying we're going to keep doing the same and we're going to keep polluting. So China has given a step. It's already there. I didn't heard any complaint in relation to the figures. Now we need to see the same from the side of developed countries. And also Brazil. Brazil said, there was a meeting here in New York, and Foreign Affairs Minister Amorim was there, and he said it there in the meeting, look, we don't care what happens in negotiation. We, as the developing countries, are going to reduce, I don't want to be wrong about the number exactly, I think it's 25, but I would have to check it. And we have already approved it in the law. So, whatever happens, we already have approved it, because this is not something that we can bargain about. We're going to deviate 25%.
You mean all the developing nations collectively?
No.
No.
Brazil.
Oh,
Brazil.
I'm sorry.
Brazil.
I'm sorry.
Brazil.
Yeah.
So, and we are not obliged,
Hmm.
because the UNFCCC convention says clearly that it is an obligation of Annex 1 countries, developed countries. It says that developing countries should only do this if they are financed by developed countries. That is what the convention says. But even though the convention says that, developing countries are already, without receiving any money for it, saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Just take a look. And we're not obliged by any agreement. And everybody's doing an effort, but we need to have the same from the side of development countries.
But is the climate issue a shared responsibility? That's what you're saying.
Oh, of course. But it's, as I said, it's a common but differential responsibility. That's what the convention says. Why it uses the word different responsibility? Because the problem is not something that is being produced this year or last year. This is a process that began 250 years ago and has to do with the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. So you can go and see how much has been already accumulated in the atmosphere. It's something like 1.3 billion gigatons of CO2. And from that 1.3 billions of gigatons of CO2, developed countries are responsible for something around 75%. Of course, China now is one of the main emitters. But it's now. What we are saying is, historically, what has happened. And that is why the whole negotiation on climate change is about, to take into account what happened in the present, but the responsibility of everybody during the last 2 centuries.
You know, if I could add, there is one other problem, a fifth one for the cap and trade at the international level, and that is that if you look at the kind of commitments or lack of commitment that the rich countries have made, it would be almost, and you add up, you know, what would they have to do if they're planning, of course, is to buy emissions reductions in other countries. There isn't enough to really buy, in the sense that it would prevent the developing countries from having almost any kind of development at all if you actually add up, you know, how much they would have to buy to meet their targets, that you know, any kind of reasonable target that would, you know, get to the 1.5 degrees, for example. They would have to buy so much in the developing countries that it wouldn't be able to have any industry at all.
You mean of all the developed countries, all the pledges, all the weak pledges that they need to make up for?
Yeah.
In terms
That's
of
right.
forest, there's not enough forest.
There isn't
to
really
save
enough.
to go around.
There really
Force
isn't
of
enough,
all
yeah.
projects. The problem is that you keep cheating yourself, because in this case you cannot cheat nature. You need to reduce emissions. So if you make a mechanism where, because you have money, suddenly you buy some certificates and you say, hey, I did it, maybe that will be very good for your commitments under the convention, but for the reality, that's not the case. Just one example. Now, I said that the temperature will increase 3 to 4 degrees Celsius with the current pledges. But it can be even worse. Why? Because you know that countries from the ex-Soviet Union, like Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, have had an increase in their emission reductions for the first commitment period. So instead of reducing 5%, they have reduced between 30 to 45. And they have what we call it AAUs, some way like certificates of emission reductions. And now if they bring them into the market, all the other developed countries, in order to achieve their commitments, the only thing they have to do is to buy them. And they can say, we already have arrived to our new target. So
And there's no reduction.
but in reality there is no reduction. But
Hot air. They call that hot air.
That they call it hot air. Yeah, so, and yes, it will be a market mechanism. You will have a lot of money involved in there. But in reality, when it comes to climate change, the result will be you are doing nothing. So, for example, in the KP negotiation in climate change, this is a very important issue. What are we going to do with that hot air if we bring that hot air to the market?
It's already, I mean, there's already RED projects that are going on that use a voluntary market mechanism to fund them, and it seems like, are you willing to negotiate to at least have the discussion to set some standards for what's already going on? Is that something you would be interested in?
There has to be a negotiation, for example, on this issue of the AAUs from Soviet Union, because from the ex-Soviet Union, because from the legal perspective, the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, allows that. It's legal. So besides saying if it's bad or good, it's legal. But we need to do something, because if we don't do something, that can really provoke a very big distortion in the whole climate change outcome. How do you solve that? Negotiating, discussing it. That's the only way.
But the only thing you will support is a fund, like a fund-based RED system, with explicit rights for indigenous groups and things like that.
When it comes
You
to
wouldn't
red, yeah, when it
consider-
comes to red, yes, of course.
Even a voluntary market is off the table for you.
Yes, because if there is a voluntary market, I mean, we cannot prevent a country that wants to develop a market. It's its sovereignty right, we don't agree with that. But you cannot force us at the multilateral level to agree on a market. If there is a country that wants to do it, we'll say we don't agree with that idea, but we respect its sovereignty right. But you cannot impose that to everyone. We fully appeal to the civil society, to the media, to the scientists. Watch out with this solution of commodifying and making a market in relation to forests and biodiversity.
That's what Costa Rica and Ecuador are doing, right?
Costa Rica, in a way, yes. Ecuador has said that Yasuni Itete is not going to be based on market mechanism, but it's going to be based on funds from different states. Yeah, Yasuni Itete. So that's another way. You don't explode a natural resource because you want to prevent a damage, in this case, of CO2 emissions, of deforestation, of loss of biodiversity, but you ask for a compensation because you're not going to do that. And until there, everybody agrees. The question comes there. Now, how is that compensation going to be arrived to Ecuador? Through funds, through a multilateral fund from states, or it's going to come from market mechanisms? And there is a difference. In the negotiations, many tell us, well, it doesn't matter. You have $10. Where did it came from? $10 or $10. But from our point of view, it's not the same. If those $10 come from the commodification and we begin to develop that kind of market, the consequences that we are going to suffer in the next decades are going to be very, very big.
Mr. Ambassador, what you're kind of saying in some respects is very depressing to me, because I cover the United States and I know very well
Nothing is going to move.
that nothing is going to move. I mean, clearly the U.S. delegation was saying a year ago that they weren't going to strengthen the 17% below 0.5 target that they had put forward. And as Julia was saying, no one knows what the election will bring, but it almost certainly will bring increased opposition,
Yes.
even to a debate on climate change in the U.S. Congress, much less legislation that would help the federal government at least achieve the 17% goal. I mean, as it stands now, the U.S. has a slight chance, according to some analyses, if various actions at the state level are fully realized. And that could bring us within shooting distance of the 17%. So having said all this, if you say that Bolivia and others will not accept any agreement if the developed nations do not strengthen their emissions reductions, that says to me that there's going to be a lot of talk in Cancun, but not a lot of action.
The question, let me point it out the other way around. what's the use of having an agreement that increases the temperature to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius? I mean, if you agree to that, you're agreeing to your death penalty. And I don't want to agree on that.
Do you think, there was talk many years ago when the United States was involved in the Kyoto Protocol, or not involved at various times, and that the whole process would have moved faster if people just other countries forgot about having the United States involved, tried to reach an agreement without them, and then tried to get them back. Obviously,
Yeah.
and if people brought that up and discussed it, I'm curious about that.
No. I think that is something that is being discussed actually in the UNFCCC. Many say, well, what do we have as an option? Let's move to an agreement of the developed countries that really want to move forward. And there will be a day where the United States will assume its responsibility. And I think that is a better option than nothing, or than to agree to your death of penalty. So it's better to have an agreement of 191 that pushes the United States to assume its responsibility than to have an agreement where you're going to have an increase in the temperature of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, or simply to not have any kind of agreement at all. And that is being discussed. And there is a movement from the European Union, because if you see, the European Union has said that they are not in a position now of any second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Because everybody begins to see, okay, we are going to wait, but the elections are not going to be good, then what's the use to wait until South Africa if the situation is not going to change? And it can even get worse. And if we keep postponing this, the whole system can begin the system of binding agreement of emission reductions can collapse. So let's move forward. From our point of view, that is a realistic possibility. It's not the best option.
Yeah, because then, I mean, doesn't the whole issue of competitiveness come to the forefront? I mean, why are the other countries going to agree on something where, they're going to have a commercial disadvantage?
That is the argument from those that say we must have an agreement that includes the U.S. And I can understand that argument. But on the other hand, if we keep moving like that, we're going to have nothing.
Europe has put in place a law to do a further 20% reduction.
20 to 30%.
Yeah.
So if we can get 30% from the European Union, I mean, there are sometimes where you need to move through an agreement, sometimes you need to move through example. And if the U.S. is not going to move, then probably we need to move through the example of all the countries of the world.
And none of those emissions come from reduction of emissions from deforestation?
Excuse me?
None of the target that you mentioned, none of that is going to come from protecting forests?
From the side of the European Union? Or what do you mean?
Your target.
Oh, from our target? Our proposal is that we should be very honest. And that when we speak about emission reduction, we should say domestic emission reduction. Because if I say I'm going to do 40%, everybody will say, oh, that's great. But when I come and analyze, and I see, oh, you're going to do from that 40%, a half through offsets and market mechanism from these other countries, and you plan to buy AAUs from this other country, in reality, what are you going to do? Oh, it's only a 20-25%. So we are fighting inside the negotiation that when we speak about emission reductions from developed countries, there should be clearly expressed in domestic terms, so that we really know what is going to happen, and not try to just, how do you say, clean your face in the public opinion by saying, okay, I'm going to do 70%, but in reality it's... All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Un placer.